The jungle was silent, too silent. Australian soldiers moved slowly through the thick green hills of Phuoc province. Each man kept his eyes on the ground, scanning every step as if the earth itself wanted to kill him. Sweat ran down their faces, rifles in hand, but their greatest fear wasn't enemy bullets. It was the mines. Invisible, buried just beneath the surface, they waited like silent predators. A single step in the wrong place could rip a man apart. And in the long high hills of Vietnam, these mines were everywhere. This was not just another patrol. It was Operation Pinnaroo, launched in February 1968, only weeks after the shock of the Tet Offensive. The mission was simple on paper: clear out Viet Cong strongholds, destroy bunkers, and secure the dangerous hills. But in reality, it was one of the deadliest operations Australians would face in Vietnam. The enemy wasn't always a soldier you could see and fight. Sometimes the deadliest enemy was hidden beneath your boots. Over the next 2 weeks, Australian troops would suffer heavy losses, not from fierce firefights, but from mines that turned the ground itself into a weapon. For many, Pinnaroo would be remembered not as a battle, but as a nightmare. This is the story of courage, fear, and sacrifice in one of the most treacherous landscapes of the Vietnam War. By early 1968, South Vietnam was in chaos. The Tet Offensive had erupted across the country just weeks earlier. Viet Cong forces and North Vietnamese troops had attacked cities, villages, and military bases in a surprise wave of assaults. The Australians, based in Phuoc province, were not spared. Although they managed to hold their ground, the offensive proved one thing: the Viet Cong were far from defeated. They could strike anywhere, anytime. In the middle of Phuoc stood a natural fortress, the long high hills. Rising steep and jagged from the flat rice fields, covered in thick jungle, they were the perfect hiding place for the enemy. The hills were riddled with caves, tunnels, and bunkers. For years, the Viet Cong had used them as a sanctuary, a place to regroup, train, and launch attacks on nearby towns and villages. The enemy here was no ordinary local militia. The Australians faced the D445 Battalion, a tough Viet Cong unit that knew the terrain better than anyone. They didn't need tanks or aircraft. Instead, they relied on ambushes, snipers, and most of all, mines. For the Viet Cong, mines were the perfect weapon: cheap, deadly, and terrifying. They turned every footstep into a gamble, every path into a potential trap. And in the long high hills, they had planted thousands of them, including captured American M16 jumping jack mines, devices that could leap into the air and explode at waist height, spraying shrapnel in all directions. The Australian High Command knew they had to act. If the long high hills were left in enemy hands, the Viet Cong could continue to terrorize the villages of Dat Do, Long Dien, and even threaten the Australian base at Nui Dat. And so Operation Pinnaroo was born, a large-scale sweep to clear the hills, destroy enemy bunkers, and drive the Viet Cong from their stronghold. But what looked like a bold offensive on paper would soon become one of the costliest and most dangerous operations Australians fought in Vietnam. At the Australian base at Nui Dat, orders were given. The mission was clear: move into the long high hills, sweep for enemy forces, and destroy every bunker and stronghold that could be found. The main spearhead would be the 3rd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, 3RAR. Hardened by previous operations, these men were disciplined, well-trained, and used to the unpredictable rhythm of guerrilla warfare. But even veterans felt uneasy about this mission. The long high hills had a reputation. Soldiers whispered about them like they were cursed ground, a place where too many patrols had gone out and never returned. To support 3RAR, the Australians gathered a formidable task force. 1st Armored Personnel Carrier Squadron, with their tracked M113 vehicles, ready to push through the rough terrain. Engineers, perhaps the most vital of all, tasked with finding and clearing the countless mines. They carried not just rifles but explosives, probing tools, and the grim knowledge that their job was often the most dangerous. Artillery and air support, standing by to blast enemy positions if resistance grew heavy. Helicopters ready to resupply men in the field or evacuate the wounded when, not if, casualties came. Before the operation began, there was a quiet tension at Nui Dat. Men checked their rifles, adjusted their packs, and shared cigarettes in silence. Some tried to crack jokes, but no one laughed very hard. Everyone knew what lay ahead. This wasn't going to be a fast strike or a clean fight. It would be a slow, grinding advance into hostile terrain where the enemy didn't always reveal himself. Iran, the Australians weren't just marching into the jungle. They were marching into a battlefield where the earth itself had been turned into a weapon. And as February 1968 turned to March, the men of 3 RAR prepared to take their first steps into the long high hills. The morning was heavy with humidity as the first Australian patrols moved out. The long high hills loomed ahead, jagged ridges, thick jungle, and slopes scarred by years of war. It looked quiet, almost peaceful from a distance, but every man knew better. The silence was a lie. The soldiers advanced cautiously, rifles at the ready. Each step was measured, careful, deliberate. In the thick undergrowth, visibility was short. The enemy could be anywhere, behind a tree line, hidden in a cave, or watching from a bunker just meters away. And then, the first explosion. A deafening blast ripped through the stillness. A patrol had triggered a mine. Dirt and smoke erupted into the air, and screams echoed across the hillside. Men rushed forward to help, dragging the wounded back, calling for medics. The reality hit instantly. The operation had barely begun, and the mines were already taking their toll. The long high hills were a killing ground. As the days went on, the Australians pushed deeper. They encountered sniper fire from concealed positions. Brief bursts of gunfire meant to slow them down. But it wasn't firefights that claimed the most lives. Again and again, mines and booby traps shredded patrols. Sometimes an armored personnel carrier rolled forward, only to be blown apart by an explosive buried in the track. Still, the Australians pressed on. Engineers worked tirelessly, probing the ground with bayonets, searching for hidden mines. Every bunker system discovered was demolished with explosives. The hills shook with thunder as fortifications collapsed in clouds of smoke and fire. Yet the deeper they went, the more it felt like the hills themselves were fighting back. Each step forward was paid for in blood. The Viet Cong were not facing the Australians in open battle. They didn't need to. The ground was their weapon, and it was merciless. For the men of 3 RAR, entering the long high hills felt less like an operation and more like walking into a trap that never ended. In most battles, soldiers fear the crack of rifles, the roar of machine guns, or the whistle of incoming mortars. But in the long high hills, the deadliest sound was silence, followed by a sudden, bone-shattering blast from beneath the earth. The Viet Cong had transformed the hills into a maze of traps. Mines were everywhere. Some were factory-made, like the American M16 jumping jack, stolen from abandoned stockpiles and turned back against the Australians. These devices were monstrous. Step on one, and a small charge launched it into the air. Waist high, it exploded, releasing a spray of steel fragments that tore through flesh and bone in all directions. Others were improvised. The Viet Cong were masters of using whatever they could find. Unexploded artillery shells, grenades rigged with tripwires, bamboo stakes smeared with poison. A simple path could hide a deadly surprise. A fallen log might conceal a pressure mine. Even children's toys left abandoned in villages were sometimes turned into bombs. For the Australians, this created a nightmare. They could not charge forward like in a firefight. Instead, every movement became slow, painful, and filled with dread. Soldiers advanced in silence, eyes glued to the ground, scanning for disturbed soil, broken twigs, or the faint outline of a tripwire. But even the sharpest eyes couldn't catch them all. The mines didn't just wound, they shattered men's nerves. Imagine walking with your mates, sharing the same trail, when suddenly the ground erupts beneath someone's feet. One moment he's there, the next he's gone, replaced by blood, smoke, and screams. And then, after the blast, comes the silence again, leaving every man wondering if his next step will be his last. Australian engineers bore the heaviest burden. Crawling on their stomachs, they used bayonets or sticks to probe the soil. Each scrape against the earth could uncover a mine, or trigger one. Many engineers never came back, yet they kept working day after day to carve a path forward for the rest of the battalion. By the end of the operation, the numbers told the story. More Australians were killed and wounded by mines than by bullets. Mines didn't need food, rest, or reinforcements. They waited silently, buried in the soil, and struck without warning. The Viet Cong had created an invisible army, one that no rifle could shoot, no grenade could kill, and no soldier could ever escape completely. For the men of 3RAR, fighting in the long high hills was not about charging bunkers or winning firefights. It was about surviving the invisible war beneath their boots. As the Australians pushed deeper into the long high hills, they began to uncover what they had come for: the Viet Cong's hidden world of bunker systems. At first glance, a bunker might look like nothing more than a patch of disturbed earth or a mound covered in vines. But once uncovered, they revealed a deadly underground fortress. Some were single fighting pits, big enough for a few men. Others stretched into sprawling networks, complete with firing positions, storage rooms, and escape tunnels that allowed the Viet Cong to vanish before the Australians could surround them. Clearing them was no simple task. The Australians couldn't afford to crawl inside. That would be suicide. The enemy might be waiting with rifles, grenades, or worse. Instead, engineers packed explosives, setting charges at the entrances. With a thunderous roar, the jungle floor shook as the bunkers collapsed in on themselves, sending dirt and smoke high into the air. But the Viet Cong didn't give up their stronghold easily. Small groups of fighters staged sniper attacks and ambushes. A single shot from the tree line, then silence. A burst of gunfire to pin down a patrol, while another group slipped away unseen. They never tried to fight head-on. They didn't need to. Their goal was to bleed the Australians, to slow every step of the operation. For 3RAR, the pattern became routine but exhausting. Patrol, probe for mines, find a bunker, demolish it, brace for sniper fire, and move on. Every explosion echoed across the hills, a reminder that progress was being made, but at a high cost. The soldiers learned quickly that the bunkers weren't just physical structures. They were a symbol of Viet Cong persistence. No matter how many were destroyed, more would appear later. And every time a bunker came down, the Australians knew they might have to clear the same ground again in the future. Still, they pressed on. For the men in the field, it wasn't about grand strategy anymore. It was about surviving the day, destroying the bunkers in front of them, and living long enough to make it back down the hill. For the men of 3RAR, Operation Pinnaroo was not remembered for fierce firefights or dramatic victories. It was remembered for the losses. In just over 2 weeks of fighting, around 20 Australians were killed and more than 70 wounded. And most of those casualties did not come from bullets or ambushes. They came from mines. The cruel thing about mines was that they didn't just kill, they maimed. Soldiers lost legs, arms, and eyes in an instant. 1 second a patrol was walking together, sharing a joke, or scanning the path ahead. The next, an explosion tore their world apart. Blood, dirt, and shrapnel filled the air, and a friend who had been alive a heartbeat earlier was suddenly gone, or screaming in agony. Medics worked frantically, often under sniper fire, trying to save whoever could be saved. Helicopters were called in again and again, their rotors chopping the air as they lifted the wounded out of the hills. For many soldiers, the sound of those helicopters became burned into memory, a constant reminder of the price being paid. The emotional toll was just as heavy as the physical. Men began to walk slower, more cautiously, sometimes freezing mid-step if they thought they had felt something shift beneath their boot. The strain was visible on every face. Unlike in a firefight, where you could shoot back at an enemy, mines left you powerless. There was nothing to fight, nothing to see, nothing to aim at, just the constant fear of the next explosion. Survivors would later say that Operation Pinnaroo was not just a battle against the Viet Cong. It was a battle against despair, fought step by step in a place where the ground itself was the enemy. By mid-March 1968, Operation Pinnaroo was officially declared complete. The Australians had pushed deep into the Long High Hills, uncovered and destroyed dozens of bunker systems, and cleared enemy positions that had been used for years. In terms of immediate objectives, the mission was a success. The D445 Battalion of the Viet Cong had suffered losses. Their supply caches were destroyed, their fortified camps blown apart, and their presence in the hills was disrupted. For a time, local villages such as Dat Do, Long Dien, and Hoa Long were safer, with fewer raids and ambushes carried out from the hills. The operation also sent a clear message. The Australians were willing to challenge the enemy even in their most dangerous strongholds. But the reality was far less simple. The minefields that had caused so many casualties were impossible to fully clear. Even after engineers detonated hundreds of them, new mines were discovered almost every day. The Viet Cong could simply return after the Australians withdrew, relaying traps and rebuilding bunkers. Strategically, the operation was a temporary disruption, not a permanent solution. The Long Hai Hills remained dangerous ground for the rest of the war. Australian patrols would continue to take casualties there, often from the same mines that had haunted Operation Pinnaroo. And then there was the cost. Around 20 Australians killed and over 70 wounded, almost all from mines and booby traps. It was a staggering price for an operation that could only hold the ground temporarily. In the end, Pinnaroo was judged a tactical success, but a bittersweet victory. The hills were cleared, yes, but they could never truly be held. For the men who fought there, the memories of smoke, explosions, and sudden death left scars far deeper than any strategic report could measure. Operation Pinnaroo was supposed to be a sweep and clear, a bold strike to root out the Viet Cong from their mountain stronghold. On paper, it worked. Bunkers were demolished, supply bases were destroyed, the D445 Battalion was pushed back. But for the Australians who fought there, the memories tell a different story. They did not remember victory. They remembered the silence before a blast, the sudden thunder of an explosion, and the cries of their mates torn apart by mines. More men were killed and wounded in Pinnaroo by the invisible weapons beneath their boots than by enemy bullets. It was a brutal lesson. In Vietnam, the deadliest enemy often wasn't the one you could see, but the one waiting in the ground. The Long Hai Hills remained dangerous until the end of the war. Mines laid decades ago still claim lives long after the soldiers had gone home. For the men of 3RAR, Operation Pinnaroo was not just another mission. It was a battle against fear itself, fear that every step could be the last. And yet they walked on. They did their duty, they paid the price. Today, Pinnaroo stands as one of the costliest operations fought by Australians in Vietnam. A reminder of sacrifice, of courage, and of the terrible truth of guerrilla war. Sometimes the battlefield itself is the enemy.